What kind of courage does it take to run toward gunfire instead of away from it? To expose yourself to enemy bullets not to kill but to save? To kneel in the open while machine guns chatter and mortars explode, focusing on a wound instead of on your own survival? Can you imagine making the choice again and again to risk your life for men who might die anyway despite your best efforts? What drives a person to value another's life above their own? To carry no weapon for self-defense, to mark themselves with a red cross that's supposed to protect them but often just makes them a more visible target? I'm asking these questions because I watched a man answer them every single day in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, and I'm still trying to understand how he did it. His name was Doc Henderson, and he was the bravest man I ever knew. He saved my life on Omaha Beach along with dozens of others, and he died doing what he'd done every day since we landed in France, running into hell to pull men back from death. This is his story, and it needs to be told, because heroes like Doc Henderson deserve to be remembered for what they were. Not warriors who killed the enemy, but saviors who defied death itself to preserve life. My name is William Carter, and I was a corporal in the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. I met Doc Henderson during our training at Fort Meade in Maryland, months before we shipped out to England. He was 23 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, and he'd been a medical student at the University of Pittsburgh before the war. He could have gotten a deferment, could have finished his degree and served as a doctor behind the lines, safe in a field hospital somewhere. But Doc said he couldn't stay in a classroom while men were dying in Europe. He enlisted, went through medic training at Camp Pickett, and was assigned to our regiment as a combat medic. When I first met him, I thought he looked too gentle for war, too soft. He had kind eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses, a quiet voice, and hands that seemed more suited to holding books than carrying wounded men. I was wrong about him in every possible way. Doc carried the standard medic kit, a canvas bag stuffed with bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, plasma, and all the other supplies he'd need to keep men alive until they could reach a field hospital. He also carried extra supplies that he scrounged or traded for, never satisfied that he had enough. His pack was heavier than ours because he insisted on being prepared for anything. During training exercises, while the rest of us were learning to kill, Doc was learning to save. He studied anatomy, practiced bandaging techniques, learned to recognize different types of wounds and how to treat them. He was obsessive about it, staying up late reading medical manuals by flashlight, asking questions of the Army doctors who oversaw our medical training. The other guys sometimes made fun of him, called him the professor, but it was good-natured ribbing. We all knew that if we got hit, Doc was the one we'd be calling for. We shipped out to England in September 1943 and spent months training for the invasion. The exercises were brutal, endless rehearsals of amphibious landings, trying to prepare us for what we'd face when we hit the beaches in France. Doc participated in every exercise, even though medics weren't required to do all the combat training. He wanted to understand what we'd be going through, wanted to know the terrain and the tactics, so he could better position himself to help the wounded. During one exercise at Slapton Sands, which was supposed to simulate the actual invasion, German E-boats attacked our convoy and sank 2 LSTs, killing over 700 American servicemen. Doc was in the water that night, helping pull survivors from the burning oil-slicked sea, working until he collapsed from exhaustion. He didn't talk about it afterward, but I saw how it changed him. He became even more determined, even more focused on his mission. He knew that the real invasion would be worse, much worse, and he wanted to be ready. June 5, 1944, we loaded onto the landing craft that would take us to Normandy. The channel crossing was rough, the sea churning with waves that made most of the men violently seasick. Doc moved through the packed craft, checking on everyone, offering encouragement, handing out seasickness pills from his limited supply. He had this way of making you feel better just by being there, by the calm confidence he projected. Even though he was scared, we all were, he never showed it. He just did his job, took care of his men, prepared for what was coming. We hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 in the morning on June 6th, and within seconds I understood that all our training had been inadequate. Nothing could have prepared us for the reality of that beach. The Germans were dug into the bluffs above us with interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of sand. They had machine guns, mortars, artillery, everything positioned to turn the beach into a killing zone. Our landing craft hit a sandbar about 50 yards from shore, and the ramp dropped into chest-deep water. The man in front of me, a kid named Jackson from Virginia, was shot in the head before he could take a step. He fell backward into me, and I had to push his body aside to get into the water. Men were drowning all around me, weighed down by their equipment, pulled under by the current. Those who made it to shore were cut down by machine gun fire. The water turned red with blood. Bodies floated in the surf. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar of explosions and gunfire and screaming that made it impossible to think. I made it to the beach and threw myself down behind a steel obstacle, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. All around me, men were dying. A soldier to my left was hit in the stomach and was screaming for a medic. Another had his leg blown off by a mine. A third was lying face down in the surf, not moving. The beach was chaos, absolute chaos, and I realized we were pinned down with nowhere to go. The seawall was 200 yards away across open sand, and the Germans had every approach covered. We couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, could only lie there and pray we didn't get hit. That's when I heard Doc's voice, clear and calm above the noise. "Medic, coming through." I turned and saw him running across the beach, bent low but moving with purpose, heading toward a wounded soldier who was calling for help. Machine gun fire kicked up sand all around him, but he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He reached the wounded man, dropped to his knees, and immediately started working. I watched him cut away the soldier's uniform, apply a pressure bandage to a chest wound, inject morphine, all while bullets whizzed past his head. He was completely focused on his patient, as if the battle raging around him didn't exist. When he'd stabilized the man, he looked around for the next casualty, spotted another wounded soldier, and ran toward him. And that's what Doc did for the next 6 hours, ran from casualty to casualty, treating wounds, stopping bleeding, saving lives, while the battle for Omaha Beach raged around him. I watched him work throughout that endless day, and what I saw defied belief. Doc never took cover, never seemed to consider his own safety. When a man was hit, Doc went to him, regardless of the fire coming down on that position. He'd run across open sand that we wouldn't cross even with covering fire. He'd stand up in plain sight of German machine gunners to drag a wounded man to safety. He seemed to have some kind of immunity to fear, or maybe he'd just decided that his mission was more important than his survival. He moved with this quiet efficiency, no wasted motion, completely focused on the task at hand. Bandage, morphine, plasma if needed, then on to the next casualty. He worked with blood up to his elbows, his uniform soaked with it, his face set in concentration. Around mid-morning I got hit. A mortar round landed near my position, and shrapnel tore through my left thigh. The pain was immediate and intense, worse than anything I'd ever felt. I looked down and saw blood pumping from the wound, soaking through my pants, and I knew it was bad. I tried to apply pressure with my hands, but I couldn't stop the bleeding. I could feel myself getting weaker, my vision starting to tunnel. I was going into shock, and I knew if I didn't get help soon, I was going to die on that beach. I tried to call for a medic, but my voice came out as a whisper. I tried again, louder, and this time I managed to yell, "Medic!" Within seconds, Doc was there. I don't know how he heard me over the noise, don't know how he found me in the chaos, but suddenly, he was kneeling beside me, his hands already reaching for his medical kit. "I got you, Carter. You're gonna be fine." His voice was steady, reassuring, and I wanted to believe him even though I could see the concern in his eyes when he looked at my leg. He cut away my pants and examined the wound, and I saw him frown. The shrapnel had severed my femoral artery, and I was bleeding out fast. Doc moved with practiced efficiency, packing the wound with gauze, applying a tourniquet above the injury, tightening it until the bleeding slowed. The pain was excruciating, and I screamed, but Doc kept working. "I know it hurts, buddy. I'm sorry, but I gotta stop this bleeding, just hold on." He injected morphine into my arm, and within seconds the pain began to fade, replaced by a warm, floating sensation. He started an IV, hanging the plasma bottle from a piece of driftwood he stuck in the sand, and I watched the clear liquid drip into my arm. "You're in shock, so I'm giving you plasma to keep your blood pressure up. The tourniquet stopped the bleeding, but you need surgery to repair that artery. I'm going to get you evacuated as soon as possible." While he worked on me, a German machine gun opened up, bullets kicking up sand inches from where we lay. Doc shielded my body with his own, hunching over me, continuing to work on my wound while rounds snapped past his head. I tried to tell him to take cover, but he just shook his head. "I'm almost done. Just need to secure this bandage." His hands never shook, never hesitated. When he'd finished bandaging my leg, he looked around and spotted a group of soldiers sheltering behind a wrecked landing craft about 30 yards away. "I need to get you to cover, then get you down to the water for evacuation." He grabbed me under the arms and started dragging me across the sand, my legs screaming in protest despite the morphine. Bullets hit all around us, and I was certain we'd both be killed, but Doc just kept moving, pulling me with strength I didn't know he had. We made it to the landing craft and he propped me against it, checked my tourniquet and bandage, made sure the plasma was still flowing. "You're gonna make it, Carter, I promise." Then he was gone, running back into the fire to help someone else. I was evacuated later that afternoon, loaded onto a landing craft that took wounded men back to the ships offshore. As we pulled away from the beach, I looked back and saw Doc still there, still moving among the casualties, still working to save lives. I wondered if I'd ever see him again, if he'd survived the day. The last image I have of Omaha Beach is Doc kneeling beside a wounded soldier, his hands working with that same calm efficiency, while battle raged all around him. I spent 2 months recovering in England, first in a field hospital where they repaired my artery, then in a convalescent hospital where I learned to walk again. The wound had been severe and there was talk of sending me home, but I refused. I wanted to get back to my unit, back to my friends. By August, I was cleared for duty and rejoined the 116th Regiment in France. We'd broken out of the hedgerow country and were driving toward Paris. I was assigned to a different company than I'd been with on D-Day, but I immediately asked about Doc Henderson. The response I got filled me with relief. Not only had Doc survived the landing, he'd become something of a legend. The stories about him were incredible, almost unbelievable, but every man I talked to swore they were true. On D-Day alone, Doc had treated over 40 casualties, working from dawn until after midnight, long after the beach was secured. He'd run through machine gun fire dozens of times, had exposed himself to enemy fire again and again to reach wounded men. He'd been blown off his feet twice by artillery, had been grazed by bullets 3 times, but he'd refused to be evacuated, refused to stop working as long as there were casualties to treat. In the days following the landing, during the brutal fighting in the hedgerows, Doc had continued his pattern of fearless dedication. Men told stories of him crawling into no man's land under fire to reach wounded soldiers, of him treating casualties while under direct enemy observation, of him arguing with officers who ordered him to take cover. "The wounded need me more than I need cover," he'd reportedly said to a captain who'd threatened to have him court-martialed for refusing a direct order. When I finally caught up with Doc in late August, I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, his face was gaunt and lined with exhaustion, and his eyes had a haunted quality that hadn't been there before. But when he saw me, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Carter, you made it back. How's the leg?" We embraced, and I felt how thin he'd become, nothing but bone and sinew. He still wore the same wire-rimmed glasses, now held together with tape, and his uniform was stained with old blood that never quite washed out. His medical bag was battered and patched, but I knew it would be fully stocked, organized with the same meticulous care he'd always shown. We talked for hours that night, sharing stories, remembering the men we'd lost, mourning friends who hadn't made it off the beach. Doc didn't want to talk about himself, about the things he'd done, but I pressed him, and eventually, he opened up. "I've lost so many, Carter. I try my best, I do everything I can, but sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes they die in my arms, and there's nothing I can do except hold them and tell them it's okay, that they're going home. I see their faces at night when I try to sleep. Every man I couldn't save, I remember them all. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, and I saw tears there. But I can't stop. As long as men are getting wounded, as long as I can help, I have to keep going. It's the only thing that makes sense in this insanity. I can't kill, won't carry a weapon, but I can save. That's my purpose. That's why I'm here. I understood then what drove Doc Henderson. It wasn't courage in the traditional sense, wasn't about being unafraid. He was terrified just like the rest of us, but he'd found something stronger than fear, a sense of purpose that overrode his survival instinct. Every wounded man was a chance to preserve life in the midst of wholesale death, to affirm humanity in the most inhumane circumstances. Saving lives was his act of defiance against the war, his way of fighting back against the machinery of killing, and he was willing to die doing it, had accepted that probability, had made peace with it in a way few of us ever could. Over the following months, I watched Doc work in every kind of combat situation imaginable. In street fighting in French villages, where every doorway might hide a sniper, Doc would run through intersections to reach wounded men, trusting that the Red Cross on his helmet would protect him, even though we'd seen German snipers deliberately target medics. During artillery barrages, when the rest of us hugged the ground in our foxholes, Doc would be moving among us, checking for casualties, treating wounds, offering encouragement. In the brutal cold of the Hurtgen forest, where we fought in endless rain and mud, Doc worked with hands so numb he could barely feel his instruments, still managing to start IVs and apply bandages with incredible precision. The men loved him, not in the way soldiers respect a brave officer or a skilled fighter, but in a deeper way, the way you love someone who's proven time and again that they value your life above their own. Knowing Doc was nearby gave us confidence, made us feel like we had a chance even when things looked hopeless. If you got hit, Doc would come for you. It didn't matter how bad the fire was, how exposed the position, how dangerous the rescue. Doc would come. That certainty, that absolute trust was worth more than any amount of firepower. I personally saw Doc save at least 20 men during the months I served with him after Normandy. I saw him drag men to safety while under direct machine gun fire. I saw him treat sucking chest wounds while mortar rounds exploded around him. I saw him work for hours on a single casualty, refusing to give up, trying technique after technique to stop bleeding that wouldn't stop, and finally succeeding through sheer determination and skill. I saw him cry when men died despite his best efforts, saw him blame himself for deaths that no medic could have prevented. I saw him give his own rations to wounded men who needed food more than he did, saw him give up his blanket to a soldier in shock, saw him go without sleep for days because there were too many casualties and not enough medics. By December 1944, the strain was showing. Doc had been in continuous combat for 6 months, longer than most medics lasted before being rotated to rear area hospitals for rest. He'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor twice, though both recommendations had been downgraded to Silver Stars because some desk officer decided his actions, while brave, were just part of his job. He had 3 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart for wounds he'd received but had refused evacuation for. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, suffered from chronic exhaustion, had a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. But he refused to leave, refused to take the rest he desperately needed. "Who'll take care of the boys?" he'd say whenever anyone suggested he should take a break. "They need me." On December 16th, the Germans launched their massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes. We were caught in the initial assault, hit by overwhelming numbers of German troops and armor. The battle was chaos, units getting separated, communication breaking down, desperate fighting in snow and freezing temperatures. Doc was everywhere, treating casualties under impossible conditions, working in snowstorms in sub-zero temperatures while the battle raged around us. I saw him amputate a soldier's crushed leg with nothing but a field knife and morphine, performing battlefield surgery that saved the man's life. I saw him walk calmly through a German artillery barrage to reach a wounded lieutenant, treat his wounds, and guide him back to our lines. I saw him share his own body heat with a soldier going into hypothermic shock, lying in the snow with the wounded man pressed against him, keeping him alive until he could be evacuated. On December 23rd, my luck ran out again. We were defending a position near Bastogne when German infantry attacked. I was hit in the chest by rifle fire, the bullet punching through my lung, and I went down hard. I couldn't breathe, couldn't call for help, was drowning in my own blood. I thought I was dead, thought this was it, the end I'd somehow avoided on Omaha Beach. Then Doc was there, rolling me onto my side so the blood could drain from my airway, cutting open my uniform, examining the wound. Pneumothorax, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Need to relieve the pressure. I felt him insert something into my chest, felt a rush of air escape, and suddenly I could breathe again, though it hurt like hell. I put in a chest tube, Carter. It'll hurt, but it'll keep you alive until we can get you evacuated. Just keep breathing nice and steady. He bandaged the wound, started an IV, gave me morphine, did everything by the book. But this time, there was no immediate evacuation. We were surrounded, cut off, with no way to get casualties to a field hospital. Doc stayed with me for 3 days, changing my bandages, monitoring my breathing, keeping me alive through sheer will and medical skill. Other men were wounded, and he treated them too, moving from casualty to casualty in our shrinking defensive perimeter, performing miracles with limited supplies and no support. By Christmas Day, we were nearly out of medical supplies, nearly out of ammunition, nearly out of hope. That's when Patton's Third Army broke through and relieved us. I was evacuated to a field hospital in Luxembourg, where surgeons repaired my lung. Doc came to see me before I was shipped to England, and he looked worse than I'd ever seen him. He'd developed a persistent cough, probably pneumonia from the cold and exposure, and his hands shook constantly. "This is it for you, Carter," he said with a tired smile. "They're sending you home. Your war's over." I asked him when he'd be going home, when he'd get the rest he needed. He just shook his head. "Soon, maybe. But there's still work to do. Still men who need help." I tried to convince him to request a transfer, to get out of the line companies and work in a rear hospital where he'd be safe. He wouldn't hear of it. "The boys on the line need me most. That's where I belong." I was shipped to England the next day, and I never saw Doc Henderson again. What I know about his final days comes from letters I received from other men in the unit, from official reports, from the citation that finally awarded him the Medal of Honor he'd deserved since Omaha Beach. On January 9, 1945, near the village of Chenogne in Belgium, our regiment was attacking a German position. Heavy machine gun fire from a fortified farmhouse had pinned down an entire platoon, and several men were wounded in the open, unable to reach cover. Doc, as always, went to them. He ran from his covered position across 50 yards of open ground, bullets kicking up snow all around him, and reached the first wounded man. He was treating the soldier's wounds when a German machine gunner, either not seeing the red cross on Doc's helmet or not caring, opened fire. Doc was hit multiple times in the chest and abdomen. He fell across the wounded man he'd been treating, still trying to apply the bandage, still trying to save a life even as his own was ending. Other medics reached him within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The wounds were too severe, too many. Doc died there in the snow, 24 years old, having saved countless lives during 7 months of combat. The soldier he'd been treating when he was shot survived, was evacuated, and eventually recovered. Doc's last act had been successful, even though it cost him everything. The 116th Infantry Regiment mourned him like they'd never mourned anyone else. Combat-hardened soldiers who hadn't cried in years wept openly at the news. Officers who'd seen thousands of casualties admitted they felt this one differently. Doc Henderson had been special, had represented something pure and good in the midst of terrible evil. He'd shown us that even in war, even in the worst circumstances humanity could create, there was room for selfless compassion, for love in the form of sacrifice. Every man in that regiment owed him a debt we could never repay. Some of us, like me, owed him our lives, literally. But all of us had been touched by his example, had seen what true courage looked like. Doc was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions throughout the war, particularly for his fearlessness on Omaha Beach and his final sacrifice near Chenogne. His parents received the medal at a ceremony in Washington, and his mother told reporters that Albert had always wanted to be a doctor, had always wanted to help people. He achieved his dream, she said through tears. He helped more people than most doctors could in a lifetime. I'm proud of him, and I know he died doing what he loved. I came home from the war in 1945, recovered from my wounds, and built a life. I went to college on the GI Bill, became a teacher, married a wonderful woman named Ruth, raised 3 children. I had a good life, a peaceful life, exactly the kind of life that Doc Henderson and millions of others had died to preserve. But not a day went by when I didn't think about Doc, didn't remember what he'd done for me and for so many others. I named my oldest son Albert after him. I made sure my children and grandchildren knew his story, knew about the brave medic who'd saved their father and grandfather's life. I attended every 116th Regiment reunion, and Doc's name was always spoken with reverence, his memory honored and preserved. Over the years, I connected with other men Doc had saved. We formed a kind of informal brotherhood, men who owed our lives to the same person, who shared the same debt and the same determination to honor his memory. We collected stories about Doc, documented his actions, interviewed survivors, built a complete picture of what he'd accomplished. The numbers were staggering. By our best estimate, Doc personally treated over 300 casualties during his 7 months in combat. Of those, at least 200 survived injuries that would have killed them without immediate medical care. 200 lives saved, 200 families that got their sons and husbands and fathers back, all because one man was brave enough and skilled enough and dedicated enough to run into hell again and again and again. Doc never carried a weapon. In all those months of combat, facing an enemy that would have killed him without hesitation, he never once picked up a rifle or pistol. His weapons were bandages and morphine, plasma and sulfa powder, skill and compassion. He killed no one, but he defeated death itself hundreds of times. That takes a kind of courage I can barely comprehend, a moral strength that transcends ordinary bravery. To refuse violence even when surrounded by it, to affirm life when death is everywhere, to heal when the world is bent on destruction, that's the highest form of heroism I can imagine. I'm 97 years old now, one of the last living men who knew Doc Henderson personally. Most of the men he saved are gone, though a few of us remain, stubborn survivors who've made it to the far end of our lives. We still talk about him, still tell his stories, still try to keep his memory alive. But we're disappearing, and soon there will be no one left who remembers Doc as a real person, who heard his voice and saw his smile, and felt his gentle hands working to save their lives. That terrifies me more than German machine guns ever did. The thought that Doc will fade from memory, that his incredible courage and compassion will be reduced to a name on a list of Medal of Honor recipients, a footnote in history books. That's why I'm telling this story now, while I still can. Doc Henderson deserves to be remembered not as an abstract hero or a symbol, but as a real man who made an impossible choice every day, who valued others' lives above his own, who proved that even in the worst circumstances, human goodness can survive and even triumph. He was 24 years old when he died, younger than my grandchildren are now, and he accomplished more in his brief life than most people could in a century. He saved my life, saved hundreds of other lives, and showed all of us what it means to truly serve, to truly sacrifice, to truly love your fellow man. That's his legacy, and it's one worth preserving. The world needs to know about men like Doc Henderson. We live in complicated times with new challenges and threats, and it's easy to become cynical, to doubt human nature, to forget what people are capable of at their best. Doc reminds us. He shows us that courage isn't just about facing death. It's about choosing life, choosing compassion, choosing service even when it costs everything. He shows us that one person, acting with conviction and skill and selfless love, can change the world for hundreds of people, can be the difference between life and death, hope and despair. That lesson is timeless, as relevant now as it was in 1944. I wear Doc's silver cross around my neck, the one he wore throughout the war. His mother gave it to me after his death, said Albert would have wanted me to have it. I've worn it every day for 79 years, a constant reminder of the debt I owe, the example he set, the standard of courage and compassion he achieved. When my time comes, and it will be soon, I'll be buried with that cross. It's my most precious possession. more valuable than any material thing I own because it belonged to the man who gave me the gift of life, who allowed me to have a family and a career and all the experiences that make up a human existence. I owe him everything, and I can never repay that debt. All I can do is remember and honor and tell his story to anyone who'll listen. Doc Henderson was the bravest man I ever knew, not because he killed the enemy, but because he saved his friends, not because he was unafraid, but because he acted despite his fear, not because death couldn't touch him, but because he willingly placed himself in its path to pull others back from the edge. He was a medic, a healer, a savior, and his 7 months of service saved more lives than most soldiers could in entire military careers. He died at 24, but he lived more fully and more courageously in those 24 years than most people do in 80. That's what I want people to remember about Albert Doc Henderson. That's the story that needs to be told. If this story touched your heart, if it inspired you, or taught you something about true courage, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. These memories are precious, and soon all of us who lived through those days will be gone. Help us keep these stories alive. Help us honor heroes like Doc Henderson, who gave everything so that others might live. Thank you for listening to an old soldier's memories. Thank you for helping us remember.